I'm backing Britain. Buy British. We should be building more in Britain. We have been relying for too long on cheap imports. We have been relying for too long on cheap labour from abroad. It is a measure of how things had changed in the Labour Party in Britain that when today's leader of the Labour Party in Coventry, in the West Midlands, the former workshop of the world, says these things yesterday, he's accused by other members of his party and others who call themselves left-wing of going UKIP light. Therein, ladies, gentlemen, boys and girls, lies a part of the problem. What could conceivably be wrong in the man that many people think might well be, and soon, the next Prime Minister of Britain, backing the country of which he's the Prime Minister, of buying the products made in the country of which he may be Prime Minister? What is conceivably wrong with pointing out that decade after decade, that workshop of the world has been turned into an ice cream shop of the world, which might do a fairly good trade yesterday, today and tomorrow, but once the thunderstorms begin this weekend, the demand for ice cream will rapidly fall. I have myself for decades been bemoaning the deindustrialization of Britain, which was partly structural but mainly strategically driven by successive British governments and their obsession with the casino economics of financial services, of hedge funds, and the plethora, the alphabet soup of financial quote-unquote heavy quote-unquote products. Because, of course, they ain't products at all. That is, dear listeners, the point. Now, I'm not a young man, though. Don't tell the wife she thinks I'm 45. But when Margaret Thatcher came to office in 1979, Britain had a car industry, a truck industry, a motorcycle industry, a railway workshops industry, a steel industry, a coal industry, an aluminium industry, a shipbuilding industry. Britain was still an industrial and manufacturing power in the world. And that is just, not in my lifetime, but in my adult lifetime. And now we are none of these things. Earlier than 1979, if you travelled abroad, particularly in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, in the Far East, if you saw a motorbike coming towards you, it was almost certain that it was made in Britain. Ditto a truck. Very often a ship. How did we get to the situation where our manufacturing base has been so decimated that in fact in just 10 years, Thatcher's 10 years, 79 to 90, we lost more manufacturing capacity than we did in the Second World War at the hands of the depredations of the Wehrmacht, of the Luftwaffe, of the Nazi hordes? Well, partly it was a matter of deliberate policy. Partly it was the idea that somehow these things were all passé. But they're not. I drove here in a car. The streets were full of buses. The streets were full of motorbikes. Everything in this room around me was manufactured somewhere. The problem is not here. And since we've been in the European Union, even if we had had a government that wanted to protect, develop, invest in British manufacturing industry, the rules of the European Union, ever since 73, and then again the Maastricht and Lisbon treaties, were forever tightened and twisted against the idea that any government in any country could, quote-unquote, rig its market by requiring national expenditure to be on national production, by requiring services and manufacturing to be preferred if they were made in Britain. Now, you can call me protectionist. You can call me old-fashioned. You can call me wanting to turn us back to the 1970s. And I'm guilty as charged, because I want a Britain where we make things. Because, as I say, things still need to be made, and they're being made by other people and not by us, leaving our economy utterly dependent on here today, gone tomorrow things which are of little intrinsic value. And so I hail the speech by Jeremy Corbyn in the West Midlands yesterday, and I do so for a number of reasons. Those that I have already adumbrated, plus this. It marks a break from the identity politics nonsense formerly known as left-wing, and those bleating that it's somehow UKIP to prefer, capital P, your own country, your own economy, your own workforce, whatever colour it is, wherever it came from, however it worships, however it prays. The idea that that is racist is one of the reasons why left-wing ideas retreated into a shell of identitarian communes and lost its appeal amongst the working class. The working class, the length and breadth of this country, began to feel that Labour had nothing to do with them because they did not fit any of these identitarian, identikit, assembled ideas of what Britain is. Most British people, the overwhelming majority of British people, want to feel that they are where they belong, and that where they belong belongs to them, that it is them, that it is theirs, that it is something with a historical thread which connects it to that which went before. And manufacturing was one of those things. We were the first industrial power. Our industrial revolution and the study of it was the very basis of Marx and Engels' work in the 19th century. They did not oppose the capitalist industrial revolution. They embraced it as a revolutionary force whose time had come and which was an historical necessity. Of course, they wished to extend it and democratize it and make it for the benefit of all the people rather than the few. But they never, the architects of what it means to be left-wing, never turned their face away from the industrial and manufacturing capacities of the people of this small island, which was an industrial miracle, and one which successive generations of get-rich-quick, short-term thinking capitalists who preferred to invest abroad, who preferred to invest in the wrong things and the wrong people, with a succession of governments, particularly since 1979, which didn't give a damn about those with blue collars, and built an economy bent towards those with white collars. And those white collars turned grubby in 2008 and almost took us over the cliff and to disaster. I'm going to be talking to political journalist and broadcaster Neil Clark on this subject in just a few minutes, because he is one of those who, like me, has been campaigning for this for a long time, and who looks back on the Britain of the white-hot heat of the technological revolution that Harold Wilson promised in the 1960s, not with embarrassment, but with a wish that it could happen again. And we'll be talking, as we tried to do yesterday, to Catherine Stevens of the International Union of Sex Workers on the issue of work and whether sex can be truly described as a legitimate occupation. And we'll be looking, although we haven't yet found a guest ready to talk about it, at the summer hunger now being faced. Yesterday we talked about obesity, and rightly so. A landmark interview, I believed. If you haven't heard it, look for it on social media. Today we're talking about the fact that a very significant number of children who are no longer at school, no longer therefore getting their school dinners, will in fact go hungry over the summer in Britain in 2018. And much, much more besides, because this, after all, is the mother of all talk shows. Well, we're kicking off the show this morning with picking over the statement made by Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the opposition in Coventry yesterday, in which he outlined plans to invest and prefer British-made goods and services in public procurement policy. This is only possible because of Brexit, of course, for it would be illegal to do so if we had remained in the European Union. You might call it the first Brexit bonus. I certainly do. So does my first guest, Neil Clark, who's been tweeting busily, as I have myself, in support of Corbyn's ideas, which are not exactly new ideas, Neil, are they?
Not at all, George. Good morning. I think it's quite remarkable that he's been criticised by a lot of people on the left, and liberal left particularly, saying that this is Trumpian or Trump-esque and this is UKIP policies. How ridiculous is that? Basically, and I think there's a very good piece which I'll flag up by Larry Elliott in The Guardian today, he's saying that basically Corbyn is only putting forward, ironically, what all the other European countries have done and do, and the US, and that is...
The Germans certainly do.
Yes, the Germans do. The French, it would be unthinkable that the French government would give out a contract for French passports to a British firm, but that's what the British government is doing. The British government is pretending to be all patriotic, and they're giving the big passport contract for the new passports to a French firm instead of going to workers in Gateshead. That's how ludicrous the situation is in Britain, that, you know, what he said yesterday was just sheer common sense, and far from being nationalistic or far right or UKIP-esque or whatever, is actually in the best traditions of the UK Labour Party, because he's actually following the policies pursued by Attlee and, of course, Harold Wilson.
We'll come back to the manufacturing policy itself. I want to probe a little on what we both agree is a remarkable commentary that this represents on the British left itself, that they could imagine, and many have shrieked it, that there was something deplorable, as Hillary Clinton might put it, about a British Labour leader arguing for preference of British Labour products, the products of British Labour. This is, isn't it, a measure of how, in the last 40 years, how the left in Britain has left the path of defence of the country and its workers into this, I call it, identitarian commune type politics.
Yeah, absolutely. It shows how far to the neoliberal globalist right we've gone, that you've got leftist commentators coming out and attacking Corbyn for saying what is sheer common sense and what were the policies of Labour in the pre-Blairite era. These were the policies followed by great Labour leaders like Attlee and Harold Wilson, who won 4 elections out of 5. And, you know, the idea that the British, as you say, the British Labour movement, the British Labour Party would put the jobs of British workers first is now portrayed as something proto-fascist or far-right. It's absolutely ludicrous. You know, the Chancellor was in the Labour government in the late 1960s. George, you defeated him.
Roy Jenkins.
Yeah, Roy Jenkins was the guy who led the very pro-manufacturing, pro-export policies of the Labour government of the late 60s, which gave us a record balance of payment surplus in 1969-70 of 550 million. Big rise in GMP, jobs created in manufacturing. That was the Labour policies, followed by Roy Jenkins. Are we now being told that Roy Jenkins was a proto-fascist and Harold Wilson was? This is quite ludicrous, isn't it? And as you said, it shows you how far the left, elements of the left, have been taken over by this identitarian politics, cultural, putting cultural issues above economic ones.
Yes, it's an abandonment of class as an analysis of society in favour of something else, sexuality, colour of skin, transsexuality, and all these other isms that have displaced classism as the foundation of British Labour politics.
Yes, and the result of this has, of course, been people going to far right parties, people moving away from Labour, and it's only really been Jeremy Corbyn basically reconnecting with traditional Labour voters, putting forward policies like the ones he put forward yesterday that have stemmed that tide, isn't it?
Now let's turn to the policy itself. I'm right in saying, amn't I, he asked rhetorically, that what Corbyn was saying yesterday would not be possible if we had remained in the European Union.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, George? Quite ironically, he's being attacked by a lot of Remainers. There's been a lot of scoffing going along, saying, British jobs for British workers, all this kind of thing. But actually what he's ironically calling for, really, is a reprogramming of the British economy to make it more like Germany's, in a way. And what happens, the other European countries have often ignored EU directives and EU rules. They make sure that, you go to France, the railways are SNCF, they're French-owned, they're not privatised. The Spanish, you go on to Spain, the buses are Spanish-owned. It's Britain that's followed this uber-Thatcherite path of boasting about having the most open liberal economy in the world even, where we've got vast waves of our infrastructure are under foreign ownership. Now, the thing about the EU, you can argue both ways. You could argue certainly that this programme that Jeremy Corbyn is putting forward is far easier outside of the EU, I think. Certainly the renationalisation would be resisted at a European level, wouldn't it? And so I think it does certainly make it much easier to do this. But having said that, as I've already said, it doesn't stop the countries like France and Germany still basically following similar policies at the moment.
Quite so. But for example, what could be the sense in the British police forces buying, as they do, vast numbers of vehicles without requiring the manufacturer to have manufactured those vehicles in Britain? What would be the sense in having a railway network and ordering rolling stock without requiring the manufacturer to construct it here, and so on? This is just common sense, isn't it?
Sheer common sense, isn't it? It shouldn't. I mean, Larry Elliott in his piece was saying Corbyn is basically saying we should do what most other countries do, and that is when we have government contracts worth billions of pounds, we give them to British companies, preferably publicly owned companies, and they will employ British workers here. That's going to increase wages, boost the economy. It's so commonsensical, George. It's remarkable that anyone would find this controversial.
Yes, particularly anyone on the left, as we've just been saying. But what about the criticism from the right of where the investment will come from. What did Corbyn have to say about that?
Well, I think what he's done is exposed the sort of sham patriotism of those on the right who love to dress up in the Union Jack, talk about British values, etc. But economically, they've sold the country down the river, haven't they, the last 40 years? So we've got neoliberal British government, Conservative government at the moment, who say we can't have a British state-owned railway owned by us, the public, but we can have our railway lines owned and operated by European state railway companies. So this is a sham patriotism has been exposed, really, of the right in Britain, which isn't a patriotic right. It's a globalist right. It doesn't give a monkeys about British workers' jobs.
Now, that's part of the reason why we got here, because the British capitalist class, which for a century and more earned itself record profits, but didn't invest it back into the means of producing wealth.
Yep, absolutely. We've had a massive hemorrhaging of funds overseas, haven't we? And that's why I think also allied to Jeremy's proposal, the ideas for a national investment bank is so important. So that our bank, we look at the record of the British banks, has been quite appalling in investing in British industry and in British companies. They've invested money abroad. And so I think the whole, as Jeremy said, I like this word reprogramming. We have to reprogram our economy here to put investment in Britain first, investment in British industry and manufacturing, and this is the way to go. We can't carry on like this any longer, George, with this massive balance of payments surplus. You and I are old enough to remember when the balance of payments determined elections, didn't it?
Yes, indeed, yes.
And
figures were eagerly expected. They're not even published now.
No, just a minor deficit, and oh my God, the government's down in the polls. We've got to do something about it. Today, it's so enormous, the deficit. As you said, it's not even published. It's unthinkable that the governments have been allowed to get away with this.
Extraordinary. Neil Clark, a pleasure as always to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Neil Clark, writer, broadcaster and journalist on the Jeremy Corbyn plan to reprogram the British economy. What could be wrong with that, I'm asking. Now, we talked yesterday, I thought quite powerfully, at least it was moving for me, about the plight of 27,000 British children aged 10 and 11. Imagine that. Every year becoming severely obese. But there's another side to that lack of coin, and that is the very many children. How many? We'll perhaps find out now in the next few minutes. There are many other children who rely on their school dinner as their only decent meal, proper meal of the day. And now that the schools are on holiday, more or less, by and large, the school dinner is packed away until September, opening the possibility of very large numbers of British school-aged children being hungry. Imagine. Rosie Oglesby is the National Director of Feeding Britain, and she's agreed to join us this morning. Rosie, welcome to the show.
Hi.
Do you recognise the danger that I've just pointed up, that a lack of school dinners might mean a lot of kids now going without?
Unfortunately, we do. I mean, there are lots of families who struggle all year round, but we know that the school holidays are a particularly difficult time. Families are having to find the money for additional meals during the school holidays that their children would normally get at school during the term time. And there's also a huge range of other costs that families face during the school holidays. So yes, it is a really difficult time, and unfortunately we see spikes at food bank during the school holidays because families are really struggling to cope.
I was a school governor for a time in an extremely successful school, but which nonetheless had 40% of the kids on free school meals. So these are kids that were free getting a good square meal at lunchtime at school. Those kids, as you say, are now, if they're on free school dinners, they're by definition poor. And there may be several of them, there certainly were in the school that I was a governor in. And the parents may very well not even have the money, let alone the time, inclination, ability to reproduce those school meals. Why can't we have a school dinner service which continues through the summer?
I think there is a really important question of how we make sure that families do have access to support during the school holidays. At the moment, there is a huge amount of support being provided by community groups in the voluntary sector. So there are groups all around the country who are running holiday clubs where children come along and do fun activities and also get access to a free healthy meal. But most of that is provided, as I say, by the voluntary sector, and we are calling for government support to look at how they can make sure that that support to families during the term time is continued during the school holidays. And the Department for Education announced earlier this year a £2 million pilot over the summer to look at how the government can support children during the school holidays as well.
Any idea how many children we're talking about here? I mean, if 40% of the school I was a governor in were on free school meals and therefore children from poor families, any idea what number across the country are potentially vulnerable, potentially at risk in this period?
So the estimate that we have is 3 million children around the UK being at risk. That figure comes from the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Hunger, who did a report on holiday hunger during last year. So that comes to 2 million children who normally have access to free school meals. And they've estimated also another additional million children whose parents are not eligible for free school meals but are really struggling due to low incomes or insecure contracts. So it is an increasing problem, and the projects that have just started this summer running school holiday programs, a lot of them are seeing more children than they were expecting. There's obviously a huge amount of need out there. And as I say, we're also seeing food banks and other emergency food projects seeing an increase in need as the school holidays start. So there are lots and lots of families out there who are unfortunately struggling.
It's a remarkable thing, isn't it, in the sixth biggest economy in the world?
It is, and I think the positive side of this is that it is possible to solve it. I mean, as I say, there's a huge effort going on by the voluntary sector, and Feeding Britain's partners over the summer are running around 79 clubs, and we hope to reach over 20,000 children, and there are other charities doing similar things this summer. But I think there is a way that we can make sure that this doesn't happen again, and that's by making sure that there is consistent government funding all around the country to support children who are at risk during the school holidays.
Tell us about Feeding Britain, will you, please?
So we're a charity. We were established in 2015 by a cross-party group of MPs and peers. They had done an inquiry called Feeding Britain back in 2014, looking at why we're seeing a rise in food bank usage in a country as rich as the UK. And the charity was set up on the back of that inquiry to put into practice the recommendations and support community groups to start practical projects to support people at risk of hunger. So we do a range of projects from holiday programs, but also we're setting up community-run social supermarkets around the country which provide affordable food to people for a time-limited period to help them get back on their feet. Our partners also run breakfast clubs. We put advisors into fuel banks and food banks, and we're also launching a new project at the moment in Cornwall to provide emergency fuel vouchers to people in food crisis. So looking from lots of different angles about how we support people who are in difficult situations to get back on their feet.
Have you any idea how many people in Britain are now making use of food banks?
It's a really interesting question, and one of the big issues around this is that we don't know with any reliable statistics how many people are going hungry in the UK, because at the moment there is no national statistical measure of hunger and food insecurity, and it's something that as a charity we think would be really important. Emma Leal-Buck, who's a Labour MP, is putting a private members bill through at the moment calling for a national government statistical measure of hunger, and that would really go a long way to putting some evidence behind this. But anecdotally, we know that there are millions of people around the UK who are struggling, and as I say, during the school holidays that really does spike.
Thank you very much for joining us, Rosie Oglesby, National Director of Feeding Britain. Is everyone I'm talking today Australian, or have they developed this, what I call Antipodean interrogative at the end of the sentences that they speak? I find it an amazing thing. It's like listening to neighbours. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. You can text me, you can email me, you can tweet me, as many, many, many people are. Let me read some of them. I've done that one from Denny. If anyone thinks this statement, that's Corbyn's statement, is racist, they need processing in a mental health clinic. Gigi, you're right. We were the base of industry, and we don't need to go back 150 years to regain manufacturing. We just need to stop exploiting cheap labour abroad. That's from Disobedient Slave. And Fuzzy McGee says, totally agree about UK manufacturing, but the left's obsession with green issues would not allow a Corbyn government to revive heavy industry on a large scale. Empty rhetoric by you and Jezza, I'm afraid. Well, Fuzzy, I can't speak for Jezza, but I'm not all that green myself. For example, I just read a remarkable piece by a man called David Douglas, a very remarkable former miners' union leader and militant in the northeast of England, in which he describes how at the Miners' Gala in Durham, just last weekend, or the weekend before perhaps, that there were all kinds of tents and platforms and speakers denouncing coal mining as somehow something that was a bad thing. But in fact, the clean coal technology, the carbon capture technologies that already existed at the time we closed down our coal mines, which afforded entry to 1,000 years of our own energy under our own feet, owned by us, could easily have obviated environmental damage caused without the use of such technologies. So, Fuzzy, I'm a bit offended by you. Mr. Corbyn can answer for himself, but I don't do empty rhetoric, mate. Fra says Thatcher helped destroy the industrial base in an ideological pursuit of privatisation, destruction of the unions and nationalised industries. How would you make these industries competitive in today's capitalist-driven globalised markets? Well, the very use of the word competitive presupposes that I'm accepting the premise of modern neoliberal financial capital, and I don't. Glenn Lai says, George Galloway talking tons of sense on talk radio right now, thank you. And Peter on the SMS says, sitting in a beautiful hotel watching the sea, and I've just been told off by my wife for going back to the room. When she asked why I'm leaving, I said I'm going to listen to George. No radio presenter has ever done this to me. Just think, 25 years ago, we were polar opposites, and you were the mortal enemy of me and my government. Just shows how wrong I was and what clarity of thought you have to be able to cut through all the misdirection and the disingenuous behaviour of governments. You are spot on regarding Syria and Salisbury. Why on earth are you not on more? Well, I'm doing all right at the moment, Peter. I'm on every day on Talk Radio this week. But thanks very much, and my apologies to your good wife. Average Joe says, sometimes, only sometimes, I think you're quite right, Corbyn. Then I think of Diane Abbott and other jokers in his cabinet and most of the other things he said, and I think I can't ever vote Labour. What was it that first turned you off Diane Abbott, Mr. Average Joe? Why did you single her out? Just asking for a friend. Tom Jarvis says, listening to Ken in Luton reminds me of listening to my grandfather. What a wonderful man. He is a very nice man indeed. And Sam Douglas says, unions ruined industries, including Red Robbo and that Scotsman at Linwood. That Scotsman at Linwood killed the 1970s car, and disputes, for example, at Camel Laird Shipbuilding, and nationalisation in 67 turned profitable steel companies like Corby and Ravenscraig. I thought Mrs. Thatcher was deceased, but she's going under the name of Sam Douglas. David Leviscont says most sex workers come out of poverty. Seemed to me to be the case, but Catherine was pretty robust in her a rebuttal of that. For someone who's been a sex worker for the last 16 years, she's read a lot of books. 0344 499 1000. Well, school's out for the most part, I think. Maybe now entirely as of this Friday. Anyway, 0344 499 1000. I remember we used to pour out of school chanting, "We're on strike for 7 weeks." Nowadays it isn't 7 weeks and nobody knows what being on strike even means. Ken is on the line from Billingham, a very industrial place as I recall. Ken, welcome.
No, George.
Nice to hear from you.
George, I don't usually agree with much of what the Unionists do in the north of Ireland because I'm an old-fashioned die-hard Republican. I have been all my life.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if you've heard of Lord Morrow.
No, I haven't.
Lord Morrow, he's a DUP Lord. And I don't know if you know, but he brought in a law where he made it illegal for a man to pay to have sex with a woman. And I wonder what you think about that, whether that would be good for Britain.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that's the solution.
No.
I definitely don't agree with Catherine's take on what she calls the sex industry.
It's
I
terrible,
do
George,
think
isn't it?
that, I mean, I think on lots of social and political levels, I disagree with it, but I also disagree with it philosophically, if you like. I do think that sex is such an intimate and even important part of human relations that it should not be reduced to a commodity that's bought and paid for anonymously. I mean, Catherine made the point that she's had some clients, or one at least, for 15 years, and she knows things about them that nobody else knows, presumably including the fact that he's visiting her. But the for the most part, it seems to me a kind of quick exchange of bodily fluids, an invasion of a woman's body by a perfect stranger for, in most cases, I'm assuming, not very much money at all. And then on to the next one. Demeaning and degrading for the woman and demeaning and degrading for the man. I can't imagine that men come away from such encounters with a spring in their step, do you?
Dream of it, George.
It's pretty sad, really.
Yeah. Well, and you always used to say that a lot of these prostitutes, they can't stand up straight because of a lot of them are feeding drug habits.
Well, that indeed, she makes the point that that's only 25% of them, but 25% of all the people selling sex in Britain is a very large number of people. And I used to, as I said yesterday, represent an area in Glasgow which was, in the evening time, festooned with girls who couldn't stand up straight, who were drugged and drunk, and undoubtedly this work, if it can be called work, was paying for their habits, and maybe also for the habits of the men who, quote-unquote, looked after them, the pimps and enforcers and protectors and all-round gangsters. So, I mean, my experience of it is much less Pretty Woman Julia Roberts or Catherine, our guest earlier, and much more the sordid and really rather tragic end of it. Ken, thanks very much for your call in Billingham. Craig is in Singapore. We better take him because hanging on the line in Singapore might cost him, no, it's probably costing us a thing or two. On you go, Craig.
Thanks for taking the call, George. And yes,
Welcome.
it is costing you, and thank you for taking the call. I wanted to talk about Jeremy Corbyn's proposal to reprogram the UK economy, which actually I think is a very, very good idea. One observation I have is that if you look at the UK government, and its perennial problem as an observer is that it's always limited in terms of its opportunity to generate revenue. The conversation is actually very, very narrow. It's either increase taxes, raise debts, or sell something, and there's really not much in the cupboard left to sell. And I'd like to throw in the conversation pot, if I may, maybe to look at a Singapore as an example, which has a sovereign government wealth fund. Now, that fund has assets under management of about $300 billion, and it generates about $30 billion of income each year, which is ploughed back into the government coffers through way of dividends and profit repatriation. And that's only a fund which is standing behind a population of about 6 million inhabitants, 6 million population.
Yeah.
So it's actually proportionately a very, very large fund.
Very much so.
Now, the objective of that fund is to invest in very high growth rate companies. Now, for example, they just invested $500 million in Alibaba, which is a high technology company with incredible rates of growth, and it's tapping into the China economy. So I think in one way of looking at this is that, it's just not a narrow conversation around having some fund recapitalise or buy back and nationalise the railways or Heathrow Airport. I think what the government should be doing, and the Jeremy Corbyn's government when it comes in should be doing, is actually looking at the globe and what types of investments it could make in very high growth companies, which could be foreign companies, or they could be UK companies that are looking to get a foothold in foreign markets. And what I'd say is that the UK should be able to raise money cheaper than hedge funds and organisations like Goldman Sachs. It should. I know it's got a deficit, and people would balk at that and say, well, unlike Singapore, which has big surpluses, we have deficits. But the counter to that is that you don't have currency exposure. What you do is you are in pounds. You may have some exposure overseas, but given the way the pound is, you would actually be gaining from that. Now, this UK GIC could be professionally managed. You could have a board of smart people, but government representatives on it. So it's not going to be like a civil service quango who's going to muddy the waters and chop and change leadership. You have a professional leadership which have representatives on the board of the government. That they make surpluses, and those surpluses are ploughed back into UK coffers. So I agree with Jeremy's plan. The only point of difference I have is that rather than looking at this as being some sort of renationalisation of railways or let's get Heathrow back into state ownership, would be, look at high growth companies. There are hundreds of them in the UK. The Financial Times published a list of the fastest growing companies in the UK. They're double-digit, triple-digit rates of growth. They're exciting. They're in technology. They're in digital. Use those investments to generate big returns, to plough back into the UK coffers, to start funding some of those essential services that are in deficit. Otherwise, you're never going to get out of this perennial problem. Raise taxes, can't. Raise debt, limited. Sell something, nothing left. You need a government investment corporation. Every other country in Asia has one. There's not a dirty word. And to give you an example, they don't just invest in very high growth assets. The GIC in Singapore, through one of its subsidiaries, actually invested in a UK bus company, Metroliner, generates £300 million. Now, if a board in Singapore can look at the UK bus company like Metroliner and see opportunity in there for steady dividends, steady rates of growth, to hedge some of these higher risk investments in other parts of the economy throughout the world, why can't the UK government do that? I don't get it, George, and that's my question to you.
Well, it's a very powerful call and a very erudite one. I have to go to the news, so I can only give you a short answer, and it's this. The much maligned Harold Wilson government in 1974, upon its election, did establish a sovereign wealth fund in the sense that it had public ownership of what was then literally just coming on stream, and that was North Sea oil. If listeners just imagine, if Mrs. Thatcher had not privatised North Sea oil, and we had taken just a tiny proportion of the proceeds of that oil from 1974 until now into a sovereign wealth fund, and had invested it in our own industry, our own manufacturing, and in investment opportunities like Craig in Singapore has just been outlining, just imagine where we now would be. Gordon is on the line from Southampton. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Gordon.
Yeah, pleasure speaking to you, George. Great show as always.
Thank you, sir.
Just a general call. You are absolutely on the money today, as always.
Thank you, sir.
You're very thought-provoking, and it makes you actually think about really what's going on around you and what's actually happening.
Well, that's my job. If you don't provoke thought, then you're left with a nation in the absence of thought, which doesn't sound like a good idea.
No, that's right. You actually know what you're talking about, and you're knowledgeable. And it's such a great pity that we haven't got more MPs of the same standard as yourself.
Well, somebody once said to Gloria Swanson, "You used to be big in pictures," and she said, "I'm still big. It's the pictures that got small." I'm afraid this Parliament just got small. I mean, people are dominating the news agenda. Let's take the now independent MP, though he seems to be in transition to something else, John Woodcock. John Woodcock wouldn't have been, a council leader when I was big in politics in Parliament. These are very small people by comparison with the parliamentary greats. It was the birthday of Michael Foot yesterday. He'd be 105, I think. He would have been if he were still alive. And, Michael Foot was a gigantic figure. And Parliament had dozens, scores of such people when I was in it. But it just doesn't anymore.
No, but there's not MPs now don't understand what's actually happening in the real world, i.e. the working man or the people who are working hard to keep their head above water. And they talk the talk, but I'm sorry, they just cannot walk the walk. And really, they don't want to know the working man. They've almost turned their back on him.
Well, they don't know. I mean, turning their back, most of them don't know. As I said earlier, most of them think Swarfiga is a holiday island somewhere in the sun.
I mean,
they've no experience of work at all.
That's right. I mean,
Parliament is stuffed full of people who were previously working in Parliament, and previous to that were working in the student unions, and previous to that were at school. Yeah,
they've never had a real job. I mean, I'm not a Labour supporter. I'll never be, because I'm not a Labour supporter. But to be fair to Mr. Corbyn, there's some of the things which he's coming out with, you've got to stand and listen to him. If he can put some meat on the bone, then he's really talking.
I agree with that.
And yourself, it's a great shame that there isn't more people of the same standard as you actually in Parliament, running this country, people who talk common sense.
Gordon, God bless you. And don't forget that Winston Churchill didn't become Prime Minister till he was 68. But thank you very much indeed for your kind words. Russell is in Northampton, from Southampton to Northampton. How's that for a segue? Go ahead, Russ.
Good afternoon, George. Fantastic show as always.
Thank you, mate.
I just wanted to share a story regarding online safety for children.
Yes, please.
My daughter's 11, and her school were using an online app to improve their multiplication skills. Mm-hmm. So the children could go on this app at home, and they had to answer so many questions in a given space of time. And at the end of the week, the school would print off the results to see who'd done the most homework and who had improved their skills the most. My daughter was doing it one day. I was in the room, fortunately. She logged on using a tablet, and the site that was provided by Northampton Education Authority, the site had been hacked by someone, and it was now a porn site. Mm. And my daughter saw for at least 20 seconds
things that she shouldn't have seen.
Part of something that she should never have seen. I took the tablet away from her, George. I couldn't get that content off the screen. I had to stop the tablet, turn it off, do a factory reset. I couldn't even get it off the screen. Mm. And my daughter saw that. My daughter was shocked. She's 11 and she was shocked. Yeah. And that was a site that the school were using, and the school no longer uses that site now because it's been hacked.
Yeah, I mean, the internet is a treasure trove, but it's also a dung heap, and it's how to keep the two things separate. If people want to watch pornography, of course, that's their business. But when pornography intrudes where it oughtn't, then that's disturbing for all of us. And it doesn't seem to me to be beyond vastly, vastly profitable companies that run the internet I was amazed to hear that Google employs 20,000 people looking at blocking inappropriate content, because in my dealings with Google, they told us that they couldn't be expected to police, that they were essentially just a wall on which people could come along and write. That is legally very doubtful, as it turned out. But 20,000 people, if with 20,000 people it's still as it is, then they'll need to employ 80,000 people, and they can well afford to.
Quite. They're not doing a very good job, or the content, they're obviously overwhelmed by the content. One point that you raised earlier, George, that I agree with, is what type of person decides they want to hack a site, an educational site?
A school site, yeah. Well, I'm afraid
what sort of person does that?
Well, look, I say that to myself all day and every day. Everything I look at here in the news, I ask myself, what kind of person does that? The acid attack, what kind of person does that? Who could do such a thing? How did we come to this? Were we always like this? Do we just know more about what we are like than we did before? I'm constantly, maybe it's my age, Rossa, but I'm constantly preoccupied by this question. The devil is present in the world, no doubt at all in my mind about that.
Well, George, I will love you and leave you, as they say.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work, because your show is fantastic.
Thank you, Russell. God bless you. Thanks very much. David is in Stirling. He wants to talk about everything. I'm always up for that. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, George. Listen, it's fantastic listening to your show.
Thank you.
You brighten my day.
Thank you,
really
my friend.
do, mate.
Thank you.
Right. But I would like to try and get some sense about what's going on in politics just now, mate. It's right. See this Brexit situation. We have voted to get out.
Yes.
Right? But the Ramoners are really getting in there, trying their best to scupper it. Right. What is going on, George? Can we take control back of the situation?
Well,
another referendum, mate, isn't going to happen.
And it's not going to solve anything either. And there'll be hell in the streets. Say it was 52-48 to remain next time. Do you think the 48 are going to accept being cheated of this? There'll be pitchforks in the streets.
Every time I turn the TV on, it says we weren't informed. We were informed. They sent out the letters to everybody.
I know, Davey, but look, all of that's immaterial. I could say that, and I have said that, after every general election. I mean, when I lost my seat in Parliament, I could say the public weren't informed. If they were only informed, I would still be in there. You can't have that. Look, the result is the result is the result. And tampering with it is electoral rigging. And electoral rigging is highly dangerous in a largely peaceful civil society.
You think elections are rigged, George?
Well, I mean, maybe some of them are, but mercifully less here than perhaps in some other places. But the point is, if you seriously advance the proposition that you should rerun something because the electorate weren't well enough informed in your view.
Ireland, didn't it?
Well, of course, it's happened in Ireland. It happened in France.
Keep going until they get the right decision.
Yes, and it's very, very dangerous to an already enfeebled faith in the political integrity of the system. So, to answer your first question, which is all I've got time to do, to answer your first question, we will leave the European Union next March. How we do so is not only not yet resolved, but is possibly unresolvable. Because, as I've been saying over and over again, and indeed I predicted it long before it crystallised, there is no majority in the House of Commons for any particular form of Brexit. That means we're going to crash, as they like to put it, out of the EU in March without any agreement. That's by far the most likely outcome, as belatedly, some political leaders are pointing out. Some of them are happy about that, I for one, and others are unhappy about it. But whether you're happy or unhappy, that is now arguably the only outcome that could occur, because that is automatic. It doesn't require a positive vote for it in the House of Commons. That is the default position. We'll crash out with no deal in March unless something else manages to obtain a majority in the House, and nothing can. That's why I said to Dan, the Corbyn man, yesterday or earlier this week, I think, that what's wrong with a general election? And his answer was, we can't have a general election because Corbyn might win it. Well, I mean, I've heard many reasons for not having a general election, and I suppose that's the most honest. But when a parliament cannot pass its measures, when a parliament is not in control of the nation's events and it is drifting towards a default position in the absence of anything else being possible, I can't think of a stronger case for a general election. Can you?
Do anything they can to scupper that, definitely.
Yeah.
The powers,
including running them over. I mean, including, by the way, a cascading red London bus running Jeremy Corbyn over on a zebra crossing. Anything to stop Jeremy Corbyn. That's where we are in this country now.
Oh, it's unbelievable, isn't it? It's unbelievable.
And what does that mean, stop him? It means stop the people voting for him.
Why are the politicians all in favour of staying in Europe? Is it a monetary thing?
Well, look, we've been in Europe, or we'll always be in Europe. We've been in the European Union for over 40 years. Deep institutional relationships have been built, particularly with money. The trade unions, lots of European money. The university,
that in their own right, but without Europe.
No, I mean the unions themselves, the bureaucrats, the top brass in the unions, have all lived off the dripping roast.
A prime example there.
Yeah, they've all lived off the dripping roast of the European Union. But there was no trickle down, you see. The members of the union never got even the gravy, even a sniff of that roast. Universities, even more so. Universities have been flooded with European Union money. That's why virtually every academic, virtually every person in the top brass in the universities is against leaving the European Union.
That's right.
Because they've been feeding off it. And the same is true in many sections of the media. Fantastic. The music man's on his game today. How about this? This is tweet of the day from Paul Embury, the London secretary, as was, of the Fire Brigade Union, now a very important member of the leadership of the Fire Brigade Union. He writes, just completed my registration for the TUC Annual Congress in September. Had to sign a disclaimer pledging not to offend anyone. Then asked to confirm my gender identity, biological sex, ethnic group, and sexual orientation. Should be a smashing week of obsessive identity politics, he says. That tweet, that TUC questionnaire, is one of the most pristine examples of why the labour movement, the trade unions, the left are in the state they're in. That is just astounding on so many levels. I bet they were a bit uncomfortable at Jeremy Corbyn yesterday in Coventry, demanding the defence of British industries, British workers, whatever their gender identity, biological sex, ethnic minority classification, or sexual orientation. And I remember when this happened. I even remember the woman and her dangling earrings who said it. I attended a Labour conference, as was my wont, from 1974 onwards. And in the late 1970s, a woman, I even remember her name, but I won't repeat it, who went to the rostrum, gave her name, her constituency Labour Party, and declared to the conference, "And I'm a lesbian." And everybody clapped. I remember saying to my friends at the time, what is that about? What does her sexual preference have to do with a debate on the environmental crisis in Peru or the public sector borrowing requirement or whatever the debate was at the time? I remember saying to my friend, my preference is for ladies in black stockings, but I'm not sure that would get the same round of applause if I announced it at the conference. That's when it all began. And it ends up with the Fire Brigade Union being asked for the sexual orientation of their delegate to the TUC, and not just their gender, but their biological sex too. It is bonkers. And that's how it reads, sounds to every normal person listening to this. And every normal person that reads Paul Embury's tweet. And it's one of the reasons why nobody will be watching the TUC, which doesn't anymore appear on the television. Perhaps, thank God, it doesn't. It's one of the reasons why so many people in Britain just don't know how important trade unions actually are. That was an unexpected segue, but got my blood coursing. Let me read some of the material I've not been able to get to. Ben Benson says, George, I lived in Germany for years, and there were legal brothels in our town. I don't know if it stopped sex crime, but the girls were looked after and were medically checked regularly. The Communicipalist says, as a Leave voter, I'm fully behind Corbyn's post-austerity National Recovery Plan. It's what I voted for in 2016. A post-Brexit vision of a sustainable and compassionate society at peace with itself and with the world. The status quo is simply unsustainable. Well said, sir. Or madam, or whatever your gender identity is. It's not surprising people in the UK are using food banks. Where are the proper full-time jobs for people? Nowhere. That's where. Look at York over the last 20 years and the companies that have closed down and jobs lost. Great jobs get people off food banks, says Ian. Very well said. Christopher Dalsky Roger Skioff, he's in Hong Kong, says two issues with your present caller discussing Singapore. First, the UK as a sovereign monetary authority has an unlimited capacity to create money. Further, a national infrastructure investment bank has already been put forward by Labour. Yes, but we need to be clearer that quantitative easing, remember the money tree? Remember the money tree they used to say didn't exist? And then it turned out it did exist. Then it turned out that money tree called QE was able to run off unlimited amounts of money and did so. The problem was what they did with the fruits of the money tree. So I say Corbyn didn't. I say let's use that National Investment Bank. Let's use quantitative easing. Let the state as a sovereign monetary authority use its power to create money, to invest, not to cut taxes for people, not to scatter it from a helicopter, not to put it in envelopes and put it through people's door, but to invest in things that are A, necessary, and B, on which you can get a return on the country's money. It doesn't seem like rocket science to me. Now, this from Sarah. My mother, as a child, went into school for her dinner in the 1940s because she was deemed to be at risk because she wasn't getting the food she needed. Neglect plus poverty. Now the Tories have taken us back to those times. I did raise that point, Sarah, earlier with the lady from Feeding Britain. She didn't take me up on it. But what's wrong with keeping the school dinners open during the summer? What's wrong with keeping the dinner ladies in work during the summer? What's wrong with the kids? And there's a lot of them, much more than you probably know, dear listener. getting free school lunches because their families are so poor that they qualify. What's wrong with keeping the school dinners open? And then the kids could maybe play in the playground. What's the point of locking up the playground over the summer? Do you get my drift? Perhaps I'm being too radical here. Bob says Thatcher, neoliberal logic, 1,000 years of energy, flood it. Transform factories into malls. Don't make it, sell it. Need an uplift in salary from the mall? No worries, your house will earn it. What about those generations of culture? Go traipse them all. Bob, that is the tweet of the day. Even better than Paul Embrace. And Danny Shell says, between 2002 and 2008, tax revenues from the financial sector were worth 193 billion, or on average just 6.8% of total tax receipts. But because manufacturing employed more tax-paying workers and engaged in far less tax avoidance, I get your point, even though it is not complete. Please don't take away my music. Now, fighting like cats and dogs, it used to be at least, quite a common saying. And that's because cats and dogs fight a lot. Most people's inclination would be that the larger, far more savage, dog was the aggressor. Turns out, actually, that's not so. And who better to tell us why and how than John Fishwick, President of the British Veterinary Association. John, thanks for joining us.
Hello, yes, thank you.
Turns out it's the cat that's the bully, yeah?
Well, normally the cats are the ones that rule the roost. Even though the dog might make a lot more noise, cats are often the ones who are actually in charge. And I'm sure a lot of people who own cats and dogs will have noticed this over the time they've spent with them. Cats are very solitary animals, and they're quite different in the way they behave and what's important to them compared to a dog. So, you know, if you're keeping cats and dogs together in the same household, it's very, very important that the cat has a bit of personal space where it can get away from the dog. And so obviously, if you're lucky enough to have a garden and put a cat flap in so the cat can escape outside, that is very helpful. Possibly feeding the cat and the dog in separate areas and at different times so they're not fighting over the food is very important. Mm-hmm. And one thing you could do is perhaps get some sort of a child gate or barrier up so the cat has a bit of private space where it doesn't have to put up with the dog. That can be a very, very useful thing to do.
Are cats more clever than dogs, John?
Well, I think it's hard to put any scientific basis on that, but I think observation of cats shows them to be incredibly intelligent and very cunning. So the way they operate is really quite sophisticated. Yes, but I don't think you can actually say that in scientific terms.
Cats, of course, are a domesticated and much smaller version of some very, very savage beasts, yeah? I mean, people imagine that, you know, a lion is like a very big dog, but in fact, it's just a very big cat.
That's absolutely right. And of course, many of us know that we have a cat that can be very friendly and, affectionate around the house with us, but actually at night time or when we're not around, it will go out and quite mercilessly hunt down prey, small mice, etc., and bring them back into the house.
And not necessarily to eat, just for the thrill of it.
Yes, that's what they do. So they could be perfectly well fed and watered inside the house and very happy, but they still go out and hunt down small creatures because that's something they really like to do, and it's almost instinctive behaviour for them.
Now, I always feel like asking people who are involved in making surveys, why did you do it? Why did you do this? Why was there a study made of whether the cat or the dog is the culprit in the bullying stakes?
Well, of course, I wasn't involved in the survey at all, so I can't really comment on the specifics. But I think, as is so often in life, we make many assumptions. And I think sometimes it's very useful to actually get some real evidence to find out if what people assume is actually what's happening. So a study like this can be extremely useful in informing people how to look after their animals and make sure they both have a less stressful life. Because a dog and a cat, if they're not happy and they're having to share space, that can be very stressful for both of them. The cat needs to have a bit of personal space. It often needs a scratching post. It needs to have a litter tray if it uses a litter tray indoors. It needs to have a litter tray which is not disturbed by a dog causing problems. And you might even need to have a couple of litter trays if that's feasible in your own situation, so the cat can go and choose a place where it's comfortable and quiet, where it feels the dog can't annoy it.
Now, finally, and I'm only asking because I've got you on the line, I was once, 30 years ago, the Member of Parliament for the vet school in Glasgow when it was under threat of closure. I remember the campaign very well, and I remember discovering during that campaign how difficult it was to get into the vet school. You needed better passes to get into the vet school in Glasgow than you did to study medicine at Oxford. Because vets, a lot of people wanted to be vets. So how is the veterinary business?
So the standard of entrance requirements for veterinary schools is very, very high. You could almost say the very best students with the very best A-level results and the very best CVs and experience are the ones who get a place in vet school. So it's extremely competitive. What has happened since your time involved with Glasgow is that some more vet schools have come online. So there are actually more places available. And the vet schools that have traditionally existed are also taking in more students. So there's no doubt in terms of numbers, there are more places available. And so the chance of getting in are slightly increased. I think it's really important that people who are interested and have the academic ability shouldn't be put off, because there's a realistic chance of getting in if you do your homework properly in terms of preparing and you get the grades that are required. So it's probably slightly better. It's eased up a bit compared to 30 years ago, but still very, very competitive.
It's been a pleasure talking to you, John. Thanks. I know much more than I needed to about dogs and cats and their various requirements. I wouldn't have either, actually, for myself. But thank you, John Fishwick, President of the British Vet Association. So yesterday we had someone on the National Obesity Forum called Fry, and today we have someone from the Vet Association called Fishwick. Perhaps it's my sense of humour. It was a very good guest and a very interesting one too. Thanks, John, for that. Alan Murphy says he's the only leader who believes in Brexit. Corbyn could fly into number 10 if he runs on a Brexit ticket and goes hard on it, unlike May. He'd have 17 million possible Brexit votes. And Claire Newton says it's come to something when the left denounce Corbyn's industrial strategy as right-wing extremism. They set out no alternative and are essentially parroting the free market orthodoxy which has led to deindustrialisation. Quite so. I'll tell you what much of the left is doing. It's inquiring as to your gender identity, your biological sex and your sexual orientation, and what colour your skin is. Julian says, just wanted to point out that we are very proud here in Ireland that our Senate recently passed a bill banning the sale of goods from Israel-occupied territories. No political chorus shouting anti-Semitism at us, is there? Funny that. Yes. And TEU Metal GB says more scare stories about Cody from someone who's clearly never used it on Talk Radio. I don't know if that one was meant for me. I don't know what it means. Slinky Rich says restricted content will not save your kids from seeing what they shouldn't see. You'll need to set up a child account to properly restrict content to your kids. This will make you the parent and administrator and control the content your child is allowed. And Bambolio says YouTube and Google want data to sell and monetize and clicks for their marketing demographics. They don't care about anything else. The 20,000 moderators will be in Manila and finding copyright material. Yeah, I mean, the very same people that can't control that content just happened to see, because one of my own friends on Twitter circulated it, that my film on Tony Blair, The Killings of Tony Blair, was up there for free on YouTube. Again, for the 1,000th time. And if it wasn't for me chasing it, or rather chasing the distributor, it'd still be there yet. And I'm still hundreds of thousands of pounds out of pocket. This from Joe Hugh. Something tells me the unpredictable George Galloway tempts more people to listen to the radio late morning while avoiding the unspeakable hate preaching on a local London radio station. Talk radio. I've got to be a bit careful, Joe, but that was very nice of you to say. And I think it's true. I am unpredictable if you have a set of preconceived ideas about me. If you actually knew me, my views are entirely consistent one with the other and over many decades. But if you have a perception of me that is wrong, you'll think some of the things I say are unpredictable. But they are not. I hope it's been as marvellous for you to listen to the show as it was for me to present it. And if so, you can come back tomorrow at the same time, 10 a.m. only on Talk Radio.